In this lecture, I plan to deal with the return of the Macedonian army to the west. They are still very far from home. In the last lecture, we closed with Alexander and the Macedonian army on the shores of the Erythraean Sea. That means the Red Sea, the Reddish Sea, and it refers to the Indian Ocean and its various extensions, including today what would be known as the Arabian Gulf, and in a way, even the Red Sea, as we call it today. This was all part of a great Eastern Ocean. In any case, in 325 BC, when Alexander had reached the limits of the Indus, he had no illusions about the geography of the eastern regions. He knew of the great subcontinent to the east. The decision had been taken not to move on the Ganges. And at this point, scholars are really divided over exactly what Alexander had intended. Reading the accounts of Arrian and Plutarch particularly, which constantly stress the pothos, the yearning of Alexander to imitate and exceed his ancestors and the great heroes of the Greek world, the argument is made by them that Alexander at this point was moved to conquer the desert to the west. This is the so-called desert of Gedrosia, the Gedrosian desert, and it extends along the shores of what is today essentially Iran, and it is some of the most desolate landscape really in the entire Asian continent. I think it's only matched by the Gobi Desert. And there's an Arab proverb that runs something along the lines that when Allah made the world, he created this region out of the refuse. I mean, it's an extremely difficult region to cross. The next army to cross it was a Muslim army in the 8th century AD, and it was extremely difficult because of the lack of water. Even during the monsoon period in India and Pakistan, the rains are problematic. There are rains, but you can't calculate that you have sufficient water. This proved a problem in the case of Alexander's crossing. That could perhaps describe some of the motive. In a way, Alexander would be testing himself. There would be comparisons drawn to King Cyrus, the first king of Persia, who had apparently campaigned in this general region. There are other modern scholars who would see the march back to the cities of the Persian heartland and ultimately to Babylon as another case of Alexander's growing megalomania. That instead of pothos, read the tyrant who is too full of himself, that the Indian conquests, the refusal of his men to march onto the Ganges Valley, led Alexander to take a route that in some ways would magnify his glory. That is, he had overcome one of the greatest natural obstacles yet encountered, and at the same time might even act as a punishment for his men for failing to press on to the Ganges River and win great victories over the Nanda monarchs in the Ganges Valley. On the other hand, there's been a study done by Donald Engels, to which I've referred earlier, a work dealing with Alexander the Great and the logistics of the Macedonian army. And Engels' study has elucidated a great deal about the expedition of Alexander. And he's dealt with the problems of distance and time, as well as provisions and water supply. Quite honestly, quite simply, really, Alexander had very little choices in terms of the return routes. And in antiquity, the entire venture excited a great deal of exaggeration, a lot of imagination. Plutarch claims in the biography of Alexander that when Alexander set forth on the desert, pushed on by this pothos, he had an army of over 120,000 strong, and only 1 out of 4 made it ultimately to Pasargadae, which is the Persian ritual capital just to the east of Persepolis. It was the ritual capital of Cyrus the Great, and it had not been burned by the Macedonians back in 330 BC. When they reached that Persian capital, they knew they were essentially home. They were back in the west. These reports have been greatly exaggerated, and there was a widespread tradition that circulated in antiquity that Alexander had made a very, very narrow escape and that much of his army had died and suffered along the way. This has been brought under question as a result of Engels' work. It seems, to put it simply, that in July 325 BC, Alexander had one of 3 choices to get his army back, and he used all 3. He had moved down the Indus Valley, conquering the Sind, and there really was no way to return by going back over the Hindu Kush into Central Asia. There was a route leading up the Indus to Kandahar, today in Afghanistan, a route that would be very well known to British soldiers of the 19th and 20th century. And it went through some important passes known as the Mula and Bolan passes. These are well known in Little Bob's, that is Sir Frederick Roberts' campaign in 1879. And by following these routes west, it would take you into the Helmand Valley and Lake Sistan, which is the ancient satrapy of Dragaeana. That was a very fertile area, and that is where the Macedonian army had wintered back in 330, 329 BC, essentially at Frada, the place where Philotas was tried and executed back in 330. That route was followed by Craterus, the second in command. Craterus took well over half the army. He also took a corps of 200 elephants and a good deal of the court, and many of the Greek mercenary forces, and probably about half of the Macedonian army. It was an army of some 40 to 50,000 strong, and it followed those routes and made it to Dragaeana, where the satrap, the Greek Stanzor, was waiting for him with ample supplies. And that part of the army, while it had some hard marching, did not endure any particular hardships and attrition due to the lack of water and the difficult conditions. And we know that in 324 BC at Opis, in Mesopotamia, that Alexander perhaps paid off as many as some 18,000 Macedonian veterans. These would be members of the phalanx, the companions, the Agrianian forces, and they were to be replaced by new drafts from Macedonia. So that many Macedonian soldiers obviously made it west, and the reports of the huge numbers dying in the desert are clearly exaggerated. The second important route would be to go by sea. And we'll be discussing that at the end of this lecture. And that was the route taken by Nearchus, the admiral, the man who had been summoned from the Mediterranean world back in 329, 328 BC. He had constructed a vast flotilla on the Indus, upper Indus, which had supported the advance down the middle Indus and lower Indus Valley. And he now was commissioned to probably break up the river ships and construct ocean-going vessels, including a force of some 35 triremes, warships, and a whole number of lesser ships and merchant ships. The figures are put at something like 4,000 vessels of all types, but he was to convey part of the expedition west by sea, and also to chart the coasts and write up what was eventually known as a periplus, a sailing around, and that is a navigational log in the ancient world that describes various ports of call and describes the landscape and the sailing conditions and currents and winds. Nearchus must have had somewhere on the order of at least 15,000 soldiers serving as marines in the fleet, plus rowers. So a significant part of the expedition went by sea, and it eventually made its way to the mouth of the Tigris River. And the Tigris and Euphrates River in antiquity flowed independently into the Persian Gulf and came up that river and its tributary essentially to Susa. Susa, the capital of Elam, which is today very far inland, in antiquity was easily reached by the sea. There were also large numbers of Indian allies and even some Iranian allies, and they were dismissed and sent home. There were Macedonian forces that were, and Greek mercenaries that were retained by the satraps in the Indian provinces. So Alexander attempted to cross that Gedrosian desert with maybe an army of some 40,000. Comparable in size to Craterus, it included many Macedonian veterans. It also had apparently a large number of non-combatants, and the best guess is that the losses were particularly sustained among them. These would be contractors supplying the needs and vices of the army, various women and camp followers, probably a large number of children, at least since 330 BC, if we believe in Justin, the Latin epitomator. Some of these soldiers were allowed to marry their long-term girlfriends. Undoubtedly, there were children. And the losses that were sustained, particularly at one point when the army is hit by a flash flood in a dry riverbed, it's largely the non-combatants that are washed away. It was a sudden rainstorm in August of 325 in the Gedrosian desert, brought on by the monsoon conditions and typical to the area. So that Alexander really worked out the logistics of this return march very carefully. Engels himself estimates that Alexander's column, at least the military elements of the column, would require something like 50,000 tons of grain to feed it in a march that would stretch, perhaps 2.5 months across these arid regions to get them to the cities of the Persian heartland. And the calculations were done very carefully. It was also calculated by Alexander that when the army set out in July 325 BC, Nearchus would set sail with the fleet, and the fleet and Alexander's column, which would be moving largely along the coast at points it would have to turn inland, that they would support each other. And in effect, the army would provide water for the fleet, and the grain would be supplied by the fleet. They would convey extra provisions. Alexander sent out advance forces along the initial parts of the route, certainly for the first 125 miles, detecting where the water sources were. He had a pretty good idea that there was plentiful local grains along the way. So when the expedition set out, or Alexander's expedition set out in July of 325 BC, Alexander had a pretty clear idea in the direction he was going and had taken very, very careful planning. However, the plans went amiss. Craterus's column encountered no difficulties. They were moving inland along well-established routes, and they eventually made it back to Persia without any major incidents or undue difficulty. Alexander's army ran into difficulty from the start. The first region he encountered to the west of the lower Indus Valley was inhabited by a group of people known as the Oiratians, and they wanted to oppose Alexander's advance, and it required a swift action to seize a strategic pass and force his way into this region. At that point, Alexander had marched about 10 days. He detached a force under Leonatus, that was the companion and bodyguard who had saved Alexander at the city of the Malai, and he now was rewarded with an independent command. And Leonatus was left with a large stock of grain with orders to await Nearchus's fleet, and he did so, except Nearchus's fleet showed up months late. Meanwhile, Alexander pushed on to a town which is usually called Bela in the classical sources. Its precise location is uncertain, but it was the beginning of a long march across what is today known as the Kolwa Depression, about a 175-mile stretch, which is about as arid and inhospitable as one could come up with. And at this point, Alexander knew that something was amiss with the fleet. It had not arrived. Maybe it was destroyed. We believe that the location of this site was much closer to the shore. The action of the monsoons and the currents have greatly extended the coast along this section of Iran today. And Alexander really had no choice but to do a forced march across this horrid depression, which he achieved at record speed. For some 10 days, he pressed the army on, and as a result, they were able to get over this depression and turn south and enter an area that at least had local supplies of grain and some water. And at the town called Pozny, somewhere on the shore, Alexander finally got word of Nearchus's fleet, and then Alexander had to march another stretch along the desolate Gedrosian shore, where he encountered the famous people who were called the fish eaters, who essentially dwelled along the shore, living in canoes and subsisting on nothing more than fish as their main source of food. So, in effect, he made these two dramatic leaps, one across the Great Kolwa Depression and the other along the Gedrosian shore. The provisions ran out along the way. Water became a constant problem. As I noted, there were many losses sustained due to the heat and the shortage of water. And it was a remarkable testimony that Alexander kept his army together and got them through this long haul. There are various reports on losses and what happened, but I think the incident that really explains how Alexander pulled off this success comes out of Arrian's Anabasis, the campaigns of Alexander. And let me read at this point from Arrian. And this is referring probably to the crossing over the Great Depression along the Gedrosian Desert. At this point in my story, I must not leave unrecorded one of the finest things Alexander ever did. Where it actually took place is uncertain. And again, one would wonder what the reports remembered of this nightmare of weeks crossing these desolate regions. No one could be quite sure when and where anything happened. Perhaps here, and at this point he's referring apparently to the Gedrosian Desert along the shores of Iran today. Perhaps, as some historians have declared, in the country of the Parapamisidae, and that is much earlier. That would have been back in 327 BC. That is a region that today is essentially the strategic passes of Afghanistan around the Khyber Pass, and it was entrusted as a satrapy to Alexander's father-in-law, the father of Roxanne, and that's doubtful it occurred there sometime previously. The army was crossing a desert of sand. This is clearly the Gedrosian Desert, or maybe the Great Depression. The sun was already blazing down upon them, but they were struggling on under the necessity of reaching water, which was still far away. Alexander, like everyone else, was tormented by thirst, but he was nonetheless marching on foot at the head of his men. It was all he could do to keep going, but he did so. And the result, as always, was that the men were the better able to endure their misery when they saw that it was equally shared. And this is one aspect of Alexander's command that is part of his genius. As they toiled on, a party of light infantry, which had gone off looking for water, found just a wretched little trickle collected in a shallow gully. They scooped up with difficulty what they could and hurried back with their priceless treasure to Alexander. Then, just before they reached him, they tipped the water into a helmet and gave it to him. Alexander, with a word of thanks for the gift, took the helmet and, in full view of his troops, poured the water on the ground. So extraordinary was the effect of this action that the water wasted by Alexander was as good as a drink for every man in the army. I cannot praise this act too highly. It was a proof, if anything was, not only of his power of endurance, but also his genius for leadership. And there was a real lesson in this. As all Macedonian kings, one commanded by example rather than by orders, and this is one of the most remarkable stories associated with Alexander. There is no reason to doubt it, and it was an instinctive action on his part. I will drink after all my men have drunk. And the effect was electric. It was those types of incidents, that type of encouragement, a combination of shaming his men to move on by his own example, that got this army through these desolate regions. By the time they had reached the borders of Carmania, which is today in southwestern Iran, which is a very rich area, the army was delirious. They had overcome the desert. It was celebrated as a virtual Dionysiac festival. There's reports in the sources that Alexander and his men marched on to the Persian ritual capital of Pasargadae as if they were the Bacchantes themselves, that is, the followers of Dionysus, returning in triumph from India. Some historians have doubted this account. They believe that this has been largely manufactured in the later tradition, but it is true that it only is with Alexander that the tradition of Dionysus coming from India in great triumph enters into Greek and Roman art, and I believe that some type of celebration probably occurred on this order. Alexander had added Dionysus to his various exempla, that is, the figures that he would follow, because he had concluded that his drunken rage that led to the murder of Clytus was brought on by Dionysus. Alexander had sacked the city of Thebes, a city that is sacred to Dionysus, and it was from that point on that Alexander paid particular homage to Dionysus. And in the Indian campaigns and coming out of the desert of Gedrosia, Alexander emphasized that connection. And that connection actually altered the iconography and the legends associated with Dionysus ever after. Dionysus had never been associated with India before Alexander's time. It was just too far and remote to Greek imagination. In the march across the Gedrosian desert, Hephaestion proved his ability. He was extremely good in administrative details. It was he who was probably behind the finding of the water sources, the organizing of the supplies. When they finally reached the coast and rendezvoused with Nearchus, Hephaestion led the main part of the army along the coast in tandem with the fleet, while Alexander made a rapid march to Pasargadae, the Persian ritual capital, to order his empire. There were a number of problems with some of the satraps as a result of Alexander's long absence. So the return was marked as a great triumph. Alexander also was received by Craterus and his men, so that the expedition was reunited by November of 325 BC in the heartland of Persia. I said that there was a third force, the naval force, that had traveled along the sea, along the Erythraean Ocean, or the Erythraean Sea as the ancients would call it. In all of the planning Alexander and Nearchus had conferred a great deal about this. The fleet was supposed to support the army. This was the traditional role. We know, for instance, in the invasion of Egypt, when Alexander entered Egypt late in 332 BC, he had crossed the Sinai Desert in tandem with the Phoenician and Cypriot fleet that provided grain, carried various impedimenta, and probably even water. The same must have been true when the army recrossed the Sinai in 331 BC. So the coordination between fleet and land elements was a common practice in the Macedonian army. The problem with Nearchus's fleet is Nearchus and Alexander did not understand the full implications of the monsoons. Those winds that brought the rain, so vital to the agriculture of the Indus Valley and what water sources were found along the march in Gedrosia, also brought adverse winds and held up the sailing of Nearchus's fleet for almost, by one calculation, perhaps 4 months. That is, Alexander, who had taken off on that march, as soon as he got to some 10 days beyond his initial point of departure, realized the fleet was nowhere to be seen, and he had to press on. Nearchus, to his credit, kept the fleet together. He actually had to fight off some attacks by the locals. At one point, got his ships off a sandbar, as many of them ran aground as they were trying to get out of one of the mouths of the Indus. And all of this information was put down in Nearchus's Periplus, that is the sailing around, that is the navigational manual. And that information was drawn upon by Arrian in writing essentially an 8th book of Alexander's campaigns. Arrian's Anabasis ends with 7 books, but the 8th book is essentially Arrian's Indica, that is a description of the Indus, and also of the sailing of Nearchus's fleet, and that formed a separate piece in the Alexander narrative. From what we can tell, Nearchus had a very, very shrewd eye. He was a very skilled navigator. He was accompanied by some excellent officers, and he had a helmsman, Onesicritus, who was an excellent helmsman and wrote his own account, which tended to be a lot more sensational and had a lot of really wild and interesting stories that got into the Alexander tradition. The fleet set sail perhaps in October, months behind schedule. It did rendezvous with Leonatus on the shore of Iran in what is today the Makran coastal regions, and there they exchanged information, and Nearchus received very, very important supplies of grain. He also learned that Alexander was far in advance of him, and so he made every effort to catch up and cooperate with Alexander. The fleet endured a number of remarkable near misses. Several ships were run aground. Fortunately, the crews were able to swim to shore and eventually were rescued. Perhaps the most important and delightful incident is as the fleet approached what would today be the Straits of Hormuz. There was a debate that went on among the various officers of what to do. It was unclear what direction the fleet should sail. And it was Nearchus's decision to veer to the northwest into the Persian Gulf rather than to take the route that looked like the more plausible, which would have taken Nearchus's fleet along the southern Arabian Peninsula and up the Red Sea. This was undoubtedly the routes followed by Scylax, the navigator of Darius I back in the 6th century BC, and it is very good that Nearchus made the decision, because within days they rendezvoused with Alexander's forces at Salmis on the shores, and fleet and army reunited. Alexander was immensely relieved, and the arrival of the fleet assisted the return of the main column along the Persian shores. And around the same time, we're told that besides making this momentous decision, and if they'd gone the wrong way, the fleet would have been really in trouble, and Alexander's army even more trouble, Nearchus encountered a school of whales. This is the first time the Greeks have ever seen anything like this. The biggest thing they ever saw was a porpoise, and porpoises are always very friendly. They tend to swim alongside ships. They're sacred to Dionysus. There's a marvelous legend about that. I myself have experienced porpoises showing up in the Mediterranean world, usually when I'm taking the ferry between Patras and Brindisi, that is between Greece and Italy. They're always there leading the ship on in the late afternoon, and I always take that as a good sign. Well, in this case, the whales were formidable-looking creatures. They looked like monsters, and you have to remember there are all these fantastic stories of the Southern Ocean populated with monsters, just as India had been populated with fabulous creatures and humans that turned out not to be there, just a lot of very tough Indian Rajas with elephant corps and professional armies. Nearchus didn't quite know what to do. The Greeks were extremely frightened. Most of the fleet were Greeks. The Macedonians were only the Marines. And the result was Nearchus ordered his triremes, some 34, 35 triremes, to line up in battle formation and charge the whales. Now, this was not the most intelligent idea. I mean, the whales could easily have smashed these ships to pieces. And what happened is, as the ships came towards the whales with all their trumpets blaring, the whales decided quite sensibly to simply submerge, that is, to go under the water, and popped up behind the fleet of Nearchus. This was much to the relief of everyone. I'm sure the whales were glad to get away from these annoying humans, and Nearchus lucked out, because if those ships had come into contact with the whales, there would have been an awful lot of dead Greeks and Macedonians and wreckage along the shores of the Iranian coast, and probably those fish eaters would have lived off the debris for generations thereafter. In any case, Nearchus overcame this danger, and much to Alexander's relief, rendezvoused with him, and he eventually made his way to Susa, and his achievements on the sea were rightly recognized. They were hailed as one of the greatest naval adventures since mythological feats by Odysseus and Jason and the Argonauts. They would only be matched again by Pythias of Massilia, a Greek from Massilia, that is modern Marseille, who carried out an extraordinary travel in northwest Europe and ending up on the coast of Norway. The Periplus that was written by Nearchus turned out to be a very important manual. His record of the coast and the ports was extremely accurate, and later generations took that Periplus as the start for developing a long-term trade route along the Persian Gulf to the Indian ports. Now, that route had been known in early antiquity. The Sumerian cities had traded with the cities of the Indus Valley civilization. But this is the first time the information was available to the Greek world, and eventually Alexander established a city, Alexandria Charax, at the mouth of the Tigris River, and Alexandria Charax rose to be one of the great commercial entrepôts of the Hellenistic and Roman world, and it was the jump-off point for all trade coming out of the Middle East and heading to the Indian ports and even to points farther east. And that trade route really goes back to the reports of Nearchus. The return of the fleet and the return of the army in November of 325 BC, that marked the end of the great conquest of Alexander. The Persian Empire had been conquered. Its former satrapies in India had been incorporated, although the arrangements were quite tentative. They depended a great deal on the local rajas, and in many cases we believe, well, the sources don't say it outright, but most modern scholars would agree that Alexander probably would have to return to rectify the Indian frontier. He was certainly eager to conquer the Ganges Valley. The march back, however, had revealed the importance of the sea route from Mesopotamia to India, some sense of the vast expanse of the Arabian Peninsula, and particularly its coasts. And it seems that Alexander's next project was an Arabian expedition. That is, to secure the sea routes between the city of Babylon and Susa, the ports of India, and to make that exploration of Nearchus part of his program of conquest. And when Alexander died in 323 BC, he was in the planning stages of a new Arabian expedition, probably to be followed by a return to India. What Alexander had found while he was away is that the appointments of satraps, many of them Persians, at least half of the satrapies run by Persian aristocrats, tested mercenary commanders and Macedonian officers, that all of these men had abused their positions in Alexander's absence, and Alexander now faced a far more daunting problem now that he was back at the Persian capitals, and that was administering this empire rather than conquering the empire. And this will be the subject of the coming lectures on how Alexander coped with the problems of putting together this world empire, and we will see that in the coming next 3 lectures.